Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, John from MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine Frontline update for the 1st of November 2024. This is broadly, I think, a sort of 2 to 3 day update, but I did this yesterday, so this is already somewhat out of date, but it does give you a sense of what's been changing over the last 2 or 3 days. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the screen at the moment, pause the video. Now, it's worth noting that Zelensky has said today that Ukraine will not cede any territory regardless of the US election results. So if Trump gets in and forces a change, he will not cede territory. So I thought that was interesting to note before we look at territory and how much has been ceded by point of fact that the Russians are attacking. Now, here's an interesting overview from Poulet Volant, the French mapper that does some really good visually clear, I think, assessments of territorial gains and losses. So this is the month of October. This is a synthesis of the end of the month, and it shows that what the Russians have occupied and the LPR, DPR in the different Ukrainian oblasts. So here we have Luhansk up in the north. So we are going to be dealing with his mapping. We're going to be dealing with this area first, then the sort of Seversk, Bakhmut, Donetsk area there, and then down further in southern Donetsk, so sort of split into three. Just gives you a sense of how much the Russians have achieved. So this is Pischany going towards the Oskil River. Coming down here, we have the Serebyansky Forest and Kremina coming up to Svatova and then up to Kupiansk here. So the Pischany attack seems to have done pretty well and got right up to the river there. Then some gains further to the south, and then Makivka and Nevska further to the south again. So the really significant, I think, gains in the Luhansk area. I'm less concerned about that. Like I've said to you before, the Ukrainians, can afford to cede all this territory up to the Oskil River because I don't think it's that valuable. The only issue is as soon as you allow the Russians to have that territory, you've got to then get it back. So do you get it back militarily? That's hugely difficult to do. It's just to believe that the Ukrainians are going to militarily take back large swathes of territory is, I think, fairly fanciful as it stands at the moment. I think that can happen, but it has to happen in tandem with a sort of political capitulation within Russia, issues there, economic issues that might affect their ability to prosecute the war, some kind of political collapse or something like that would allow the troops to take this back kind of quasi-militarily, or it happens in negotiation. So the more you allow the Russians to take territory, the harder it is to get it back, right? That seems to be fairly obvious. So I don't think this has that much intrinsic value, but it then just becomes an extra bargaining chip for the Russians. Now, it's a little bit more serious when we come down to the Donetsk area and further to the south, where these cities, it's not like effectively farming land up to the Oskil River. These are cities that have a lot of meaning, like Pokrovsk itself down further down here is important in terms of coal mining and whatnot, and they've kind of lost that. So there are these, for example, behind Chasiv Yar, you've got Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, Zhuravlevka, Konstantinivka, these larger settlements that are, I think, much more important. And you can see here that some small gains on that northern part of the Seversk area, little one there in Serebyansky Forest that I haven't myself noted. And then further down south of Chasiv Yar around the Klishchivka area there. But nothing too substantial. There is this pressure on Chasiv Yar, which is a challenge. And then we have Toretsk and New York down at the bottom there, showing some Russian gains, of course, as we've seen. That's interesting because the Ukrainians are pushing back in Toretsk, and they're continuing to do that actually at the moment. So we'll talk about that in a little while. And then down in the south, we can see some much greater gains for the Russians. Really problematic here as the Russians are encroaching on Kurakhivka. They've taken Kurakhivka just to the north of there. That pocket has been filled in. And also further down south around Vuhledar, where they've sort of marched on there and taken a lot of ground. So you'd imagine that's going to equalise as they take Kurakhivka. And they, I can't see it looking good for the Ukrainians in that kind of area. Okay. So that's just a bit of an overview. Didn't obviously talk about the northern area here, and we're going to look at Kursk first. So fairly stable in Kursk. Bear in mind this is a couple of days worth of change. We have the dark red pins there of Surat maps, but I think that could be a problematic bit of pinning where it has actually just pinned along the line as marginal line change. So even that's irrelevant in my opinion. So really quite stable in Kursk at the moment. Be interested to see if there's any further change in the last 24 hours. And then when we come further to the west, we can see some changes around here. Again, fairly minor changes, only some small parts of a few of these fields to the west of Zhuravlevka. Now this, remember, is a Russian defensive line. It doesn't mean that the Ukrainians have pushed up to this line. It means the Russians have been pushed back to here, and everything in front will be some degree of grey zone until you get a Ukrainian defensive line further on. Now Surat Maps doesn't have this mapped at all. This is different to what a lot of people are saying. So here we've got Intel Schizo talking about, and we'll bring up the map here. So that's the area to the west of this Lipsy Kharkiv attack that the Russians had done, and the Ukrainians pushing across the border into Zhuravlevka. So since October the 16th, the elements of the 3rd Spartan Brigade have started conducting positional skirmishes in Zhuravlevka and Kurakhivka with tactical success in this direction. I highlighted previously this threatens Russia's main supply line by road for the task group, the North Lipsy task group north in the Lipsy sector, and threatens the right flank of Russian forces in this area. Orange is the Russian supply line by road, black is a rail line. So here you have a road supply line going through there, as well as I think some railway. I'm not sure, is that black is the rail line. I can't see any black on that. It might be in the other picture. Yes, okay, so the rail line comes down further to the north, and then that connect to the road, and then that's how they are supplying Lipsy, and that's kind of being challenged by the attacks into this area. Now, Geek from Andrew Perpetua's team says the 1st Belgorod detachment acknowledges Ukrainian forces were present in the forest, however denies any Ukrainian presence in the town of Zhuravlevka in Belgorod itself. So we go back to my map. So they are saying that the Ukrainians are here in the forest area, but they are not actually in the town, whereas this would suggest that there is some kind of grey zone and they could well be fighting within Zhuravlevka. So that's what the Russians have claimed. There is some evidence of shelling in that, I presume, that forest area here. So that's being geolocated. So we'll have a look to see where that is. Oops. And see if we can find that on this map. This is a Google Maps version and not an Earth version. So yes, okay, that is basically in the middle of the forest. Let's just get rid of that. So that is where they are hitting with the MLRS. That would suggest that the Ukrainians are in the forest there, in that area. That may be true that the Russians, what the Russians are claiming, that the Ukrainians aren't in that that area of the town. They're not in the town, but they are just around in the forest area surrounding it. But it's interesting that the Ukrainians are pushing there. We'll see what happens. Let's just do this second geolocation, see if it tells us anything. So there you go. That is actually just on the edge of where the Russian line was. And that's probably what caused Andrew Perpetua, because Gick is part of his team, to push back the Russian line further from there, because the Russians are themselves shelling here. So if they're shelling there, the Russians aren't going to be there. So their defensive line has to, by definition, be further back. So there you go. That's in the Zhuravlevka area. We're going to come further to the south, and we can see along that, northeastern axis, there's an awful lot of... sorry. This is what happens when you do too much talking. So there's an awful lot of rather problematic Russian gains here. An awful lot of reddish pins from Surat map. So let's just I'm not going to go into the finer details of the Zuriat Maps claims and the tweets. I'm just going to run down the front line today and hopefully pick it up a little more as we go further on throughout the next week. But Kupiansk there, the Russians claiming territory right up to the Oskil River as it is at the top. It's very difficult to get across the Oskil River here because it is an incline and bluffs the other side, so it becomes difficult to get across the river and get purchase in a lot of these places. If I come down and go into the 3D mode, I don't think I can do the 3D mode in maps. That's really annoying. Okay, I might have to go back to using Earth. So basically there is higher ground all along here on the western side of the river, so you would imagine the Russians are going to push up to that river, so this doesn't really concern me too much. But they are encroaching very much on Kupiansk, it appears, both from the north, the east, and the south. Some gains to the east there, just in small field areas to the west of Kislivka and Kotelyrivka. Goodness me, I remember when they were fighting around that, and Ivanivka and Yahidny. Orliansky, goodness me, all that time ago. It seems like an age ago. But anyway, they are having, according to Zuriat Maps again, some further success just south of Kurakhivka, just on the Oskil River there. So again, they're getting this foothold right on that river and then seeking to sort of fill it all in. As you can see, that area, this area, and another one further to the south near Lozova, the Russians making those gains, as according to Zuriat Maps and according to Andrew Perpetua, filling in a lot of this area around Stelamakivka and so on and so forth, and a little bit down near Persho-Travnevi there. That's not to be confused with the Persho-Travnevi up here, because, Ukraine. So, yeah, really, I think... well, I say problematic for the Ukrainians, but I've also just said it's not too much of a problem losing this. But the Russians really are taking quite a bit of land in this area, at least according to Zuriat Maps, pro-Russian mapper. Tiny bit further down to the south around Novovodyane. That's a bit of a glitch in there. And then a bit of a change here, according to Zuriat Maps, in terms of the Russians taking a bit of land to the northeast of Terny and around Ivanivka, but then losing a bit, or at least there's a bit of rejigging there to say actually the Ukrainians have control, or this is more of a grey zone of this area there. So a bit of give and take there, but essentially the Russians are pushing, and likewise further to the south towards Zarichne, north of Torska, they're pushing again. This time not to the Oskil River. This is where that's the Zherebets River. So the Oskil River comes all the way down here. And actually, you got Oskil there, you got the Sierra Donetsk River coming along here, and you have the Zherebets River coming north-south there, which they have, that's what they got across up here, and they seem to be, making hay while the sun shines before the weather gets too bad, just taking as much ground as they possibly can. And then when we come down to Seversk front and Chasiv Yar, there are some gains for the Russians there, not massively significant, as according to Zuriat Maps. Again, we do still have this vast difference between the mappers in this area, where the Zuriat Maps claims that the Russians control much more of the outskirts of Chasiv Yar to the west of the canal. So the canal comes down here, and we have so there it is, coming up there, going up past Kalinivka, and we have Zuriat Maps having Russians in control of quite a lot of Chasiv Yar there, and then a lot more of the south on the way to Stupochki by the T0504 highway, and that's the one that goes through Konstantinivka and all the way down here past the Pokrovsk bridgehead there. Now, that is challenging for the Ukrainians, but I think Chasiv Yar, they've done a really good job of holding out there. And they are pushing back in the Toretsk area, as according to, well, you can see just a minor change for Andrew Perpetua. But there are other mappers that are saying that the Russians are being pushed back in Toretsk. Here we have Grayskull saying more reported Ukrainian successful counterattacks inside Toretsk there. So if we look at this, that's where the stadium is in Toretsk, and that gives us a bit of a landmark to understand where we're talking about here. So this is basically around this kind of area that Surat Maps has fully under the control of the Russians, but Grayskull and Andrew Perpetua not so much. And they have just, that's more in line with what Andrew Perpetua has, what Grayskull has here. Coming down that road just before it goes up there. So, yeah, very similar. And Grayskull here has the Russians being pushed back in that area. If we say, yeah, so more successful counterattacks. And then further success as well, just in a small part of Toretsk as well, similar to where we were just seeing, pushing back the Russians in this area, and that's kind of what Andrew Perpetua, not sure, a little bit of funky mapping going on there, but I think the idea is that the Ukrainians have pushed back the Russians there as well. So that's kind of the one area where the Ukrainians are doing these counterattacks. Otherwise, they're just under the cosh right along the rest of the this front, going all the way down to your Vuhledar and on the way to Zaporizhzhia. It's this corner here that the Russians are just relentlessly improving their territorial gains, their territorial control. So a little tree line there north of Mykolaiivka, towards that T0504 highway. Just, yeah, getting my bearings straight there. Yeah, so that is that highway that I was talking about coming down from Chasiv Yar. So they haven't really got that much closer to interdicting it. We were expecting them to go through Vodzhenka there, but they haven't really done that. They've been held back and somewhat held back here, and that's because I think this is one of their main, the Ukrainian trench lines here. Instead, they're doing all this stuff south of there. So it'd be interesting to see where the main Ukrainian trench lines exist outside of this axis there. Anyway, the Russians pushing on, as according to Andrew Perpetua, sort of agreeing with some of the mapping of Surat Maps south of there, Suky Yar, on the way down to this Selydove area, which has now been filled in. Both mappers now agree that the Russians are now in control of Selydove, and in fact pushing on further to the northwest as well. Some gains for Surat Maps just to the west of Selydove, and for Andrew Perpetua more widespread in line with what Surat Maps had claimed, both to the west and southwest of Selydove. And then as we come further to the south, they're just marching on again in this very sort of rural region, but with these towns, these villages dotted around, and in this case they're getting close to or control half of Novomitrivka there. And then, goodness me, it appears that Kurakhivka, which was pretty well defended. Greg Terry was talking about that last live I did with him, saying the Ukrainians are defending that fairly well, but they're pretty much surrounded. So they appear to have pulled out of there, and we see some wide-scale control of that area, and a little bit to the north as well. It looks really challenging for the Ukrainians there, and as you can see, both mappers showing the Russians really having advanced on in that area. And then a tiny bit here towards Kurakhivka, and Kurakhivka is under a lot of pressure. So let's have a little look at Emil Kastilhamy talking about this kind of area. And actually, it might be worth getting a sense of, no, we'll talk about this area first and then the whole region, what his thoughts are on that. Before we go there, no report says update around Kurakhivka and Kurakhivka. The Russian troops have taken Hirnik, and actually they've taken now Kurakhivka. So this is Kurakhivka, sorry. This is from October the 30th. So they are geolocated in the industrial area west of Kurakhivka. It is highly unlikely that Ukrainian troops are still in Kurakhivka, Zoriane, and the area east of Zoriane. They have already retreated to the west to take up new defensive positions there, and that appears to be what both the mappers on my map suggest, is that, just to let you know what they're talking about, so Hirnik is this area that went first, and then Kurakhivka, Zoriane, they basically pulled out there towards Vovchenka. Yes, so Intel Schizo here saying, let's drop into this one. As I pointed out last month, and that time is approaching, with Kurakhivka about to fall in the coming weeks. Ukraine must destroy the road and rail bridge and dams over the Volcha River. Destroying these two bridges and dams in Kurakhivka will hinder Russian logistics in the subsequent battle for Pokrovsk and dampen Russia's ability to springboard in the likely event that the city falls under Russian control, and to delay the ability of establishing Pokrovsk as a new forward logistical hub for several months, restricting the amount of supplies that can flow from Donetsk to the front. Blowing these bridges will also temporarily impede a Russian advance west along the N15 highway. If Ukraine does not destroy these two bridges and dams, this will be a tactical and operational blunder. In blue is a Ukrainian rail, and black is occupied rail used by Russia. Rail used by Russia. Red is the current front line. Okay, let's try and make sense of that. So here we have Pokrovsk. We have Kurakhivka that is under an awful lot of pressure, and you've got Kurakhivka, this area that's been now filled in. You've got these blue lines. So let's go over what these lines mean again. So Ukrainian rails in blue, and then it gets to black where it's controlled by the Russians. Obviously, this now controlled by the Russians there. Rail used by Russia is in black, and then you have the front line is in red there. Okay, and that's possibly changed around there to be filled in a little bit. So he's saying that the Ukrainians should blow these bridges in order to hamper the Russian logistics, and a dam there. So if we go and put that on the map, what we're doing is we're talking about here in Kurakhivka, blowing that so that the Russian logistics in the area are affected. We'll see. And, you know, I assume the Russians haven't blown that precisely because they want that intact. So there is that. Okay, so the town of Kurakhivka has likely fallen to the Russians, says Emil Castelhelmi. He said this yesterday. Staying there would have been an unnecessary risk, he says. So that gives you the map of what's going on. We're talking about pulling out of there and through to the north of these reservoirs. And the only existing supply line ran along the open strip of land about a kilometre wide. Ukrainians will continue the defence of the villages of Ilinka and Stepanivka. So these are the ones just north of the reservoir. My previous assessment of the general situation. Yeah, so we are going to look at his previous assessment of the general situation here. So this goes in to talk about both the Kurakhivka area and Kurakhivka and just north of there, but as well down here by Vuhledar in that southern southeastern corner of that Donetsk front line. So we're going to be talking about all this area. So just on my map, you can see the vast numbers of pins that show that the Russians are advancing around Konstantinivka and then also north of Vuhledar. They're just filling in all these large areas of land and pushing further to the north. They took that town of Bohoyavlenka. Most of that, at the very least, has been taken. I reported on that the other day, and then pushing forward to these other places, Shakhtarsk and Yasna Polyana. There, Shakhtarsk is being mentioned quite a bit. I think that might feature in, yeah, that's this one. So another mapping update there from someone else talking about the village of Yasna Polyana and Shakhtarsk. And I think flags being flown over those villages show they've been fully captured, is the claim here. So that's what the Russians are doing in all of these, in all of that southeastern corner. So let's go back to Emil Castelhelmi to give us a sense of what's going on. So the Russians recently launched a large offensive in eastern and southern Donetsk on a 70-kilometer wide front. The attack has breached Ukrainian defenses in just a few days in many areas, and there can be some dangerous development ahead, which I'll discuss in this thread. So remember, this is a couple of days old. Some of these mapping elements have changed, so the Russians have filled that in pretty much, and they pushed further north in these areas. So anyway, he says the operation has two main focus areas, the Selydove and Kurakhivka area and the southern direction where the enemy is currently advancing in the area between Shakhtarsk and Bohoyavlenka. Both directions have their own problems and threats. So in other words, this area here and that area there. Okay. So what does he say? in a short time frame, Ukraine has very likely lost Selydove, over 21,000 pre-invasion residents, which is the largest city Russia has captured since the fall of Avdiivka. Simultaneously, Russians have captured Hrynik, 10,000 pre-invasion residents. The Russians are now continuing east and are likely trying to create an encirclement threat to force the Ukrainians to retreat from Kurakhivka, which they've done. If they're able to advance in the Kurakhivka reservoir, it would provide them with a good starting points for further operations. In the southern direction, the Russians have advanced 10 kilometers in just a few days. They now control at least most of Shakhtarska and Novoroukrenka and likely have complete control over Yavlenka. One could say that Ukraine can afford losing ground here, but I disagree. Losing much more ground here can have severe implications. The issues are clear when we look at the Ukrainian level of preparedness in the area. The Russians are currently flanking the last fortified main defensive positions in Novoroukrenka. There's not much beyond them. So here we start to get a sense of some of these main defensive lines, and there does seem to be rather a large important gap going on here, which could be a bit of a problem. There are some field fortifications in the tree lines which we haven't been able to map, but larger prepared positions don't seem to exist, at least in sufficient numbers. The situation also doesn't enable Ukrainians to start digging quickly more in the immediate proximity. The Russian pace of advance and the aerial capabilities likely won't allow Ukraine to bring construction equipment very close to the front, at least without high losses for the Ukrainians. There also aren't any very significant natural obstacles in the area. It's mostly flat. And this is the complaint, that while they're holding out in Vuhledar, so down here for all these months, not enough was being done, was being built up here. In the big picture, these are the most strongly fortified and most defendable areas with the best natural obstacles. However, in the worst case scenarios, the Russians are able to bypass and flank them by taking advantage of the current weak spots of the Ukrainian defense, which I would imagine would be here. But then, of course, you've got the river as a natural obstacle there. But it's looking like you can sort of flank them and get through some weak spots. Scenario 1, a possible goal for Russia after reaching the Kurakhivka reservoir, the Russians would continue their advance towards the town of Andriivka, advancing on the ridgeline, and would mostly nullify its defensive advantages. So there you go. Simultaneously, the southern push would continue to make progress towards Andriivka. This development could force the Ukrainian defenders out of the heavily fortified Kurakhivka area, as the supply lines would be threatened. So you've got this hook around Kurakhivka where they are likely to be able to hold out at least for some time here. But actually, how long? If the Russians are north of that river, of that reservoir, how does that affect the Ukrainians on this side? They're just going to be absolutely hammered by, you would think, all sorts of aerial bombardments and artillery, etc., etc. So it's just, I would imagine, you just flatten it, and that's a problem. The Russian approach is to flatten places and then walk in, not kind of fight over those places street to street, but actually just flatten them straight away. So this would require significant forces and continuous success for the Russians. However, if they could pull off this maneuver, they could avoid an expensive grind against the vast trench networks and difficult ridge lines in the Kurakhivka Andriivka area. So this is Andriivka there that we're talking about further to the west of Kurakhivka. So scenario 2, this would include the same idea but on a smaller scale. The pincers would try to cut the defenders off at the nearest possible point, which would be Dachne. And so Dachne is that place just there, here, which is to the west of Kurakhivka and just at the end of that reservoir. As you can see there, that's it on the map of Emil Kestelheimy. Despite losing Kurakhivka, the defenders could continue fighting in more favourable positions, maybe up here, and using the river. At the moment, the Russians are struggling to expand their breach into a breakthrough, even though the Ukrainians are losing many square kilometres. The defence hasn't crumbled into chaos, and nothing extremely crucial has been lost. It's very well possible that the Ukrainians are able to transfer reserves to the area and grind down the mechanised assaults before either of the aforementioned worst-case scenarios materialise. However, if current trends continue, Ukraine could lose Kurakhivka before 2025. In October, the Russians succeeded in occupying relatively large areas, according to our calculations. Likely more Ukrainian land has been captured than in any other single month since the summer of 2022. In addition, Russia has captured some territories recaptured territories, in Kursk. For reference, in dark red, we see the assessed Russian-controlled area in the beginning of August 2024 before the Ukrainian Kursk offensive. The light red depicts areas captured after the Kursk operation in the Eastern Front. In other words, they've captured all of this, a bunch of land up here as well, and up in Toretsk area, New York area. Toretsk in New York, up north of Bakhmut, there's Chasiv Yar around there. So, vast areas around the Prokrovsk and Vuhledar area. The overall situation is very concerning, and the Ukrainians are stretched thin. The coming winter will likely be difficult. And yeah, there you go. That's where we're at, which is really challenging in this southeastern part of the front line, but also challenging up in the Oskil River area. And Chasiv Yar will become under increasing pressure, I think, possibly as they're able to throw more troops around the front lines, Russian troops. If they can pull out a lot of Russian troops from places like Kursk and substitute them with North Korean troops, then it gives the Russians quite an advantage. And this is, North Korean troops are a game changer for Russia. If they, depending on how many they can get, they suddenly got access to 100,000 troops that they can throw into what is already meat grinder attacks anywhere, then they can just continue doing what they do, which is grind down the Ukrainians. And yes, it grinds themselves down, but they don't really care if it's 100,000 North Koreans. I mean, it's a real issue, and something needs to be done about the North Korean problem. Anyway, that's enough from me. Thank you for watching. Please take care, and I'll speak to you soon. Toodle pips.